The architects of the Knox building had wasted no time in trying to make it look taller than its 20 stories, with the result that it looked shorter. They hadn't bothered trying to make it handsome either, and so it was ugly. Slab-sided and flat-topped, with a narrow pea-green cornice that jutted like the lip of a driven stake. It stood in an appropriately humdrum section of lower Midtown, and from the very day of its grand opening, early in the century, it must clearly have been destined to settle deep into that smoke-hung clutter of numberless rectilinear shapes out of which, in aerial photographs, the mightier towers of New York emerge and rise. But for all its plainness, the Knox building did convey a quality of massive common sense. If it lacked grandeur, at least it had bulk. If there was nothing heroic about it, there was certainly nothing frivolous. It was a building that meant business. "There it is, Frank," Earl Wheeler said to his son on a summer morning in 1935. "Straight ahead. That's the Home Office. Better take my hand here. This is a bad crossing." It was the only time Frank had ever been brought to New York by his father, and it had come as the climax to an exhilarating several weeks that always seemed, in retrospect, the only time his father could ever have been described as jovial. During that time, the cryptic phrase "Oatfields" had flown in happy profusion through his father's dinner table talk, along with New York and the Home Office, and had repeatedly caused his mother to say, "Oh, that's wonderful, Earl," and "Oh, I'm so glad." Frank had eventually figured out that Oatfields had nothing whatever to do with Quaker oats, but was in fact the odd name of a man, Mr. Oatfields, a man remarkable not only in his size, one of the biggest men in the Home Office, but in his intellectual astuteness. And he'd scarcely put this information straight in his mind before being presented by his mother with some startling news. Mr. Oatfields, upon learning that Mr. Earl Wheeler had a son of 10, had invited that son to accompany his father on a visit to the Home Office. Father and son would then be the guests of Mr. Fields at luncheon. It was the first time he'd ever heard her use that word instead of lunch. Following which, Mr. Fields would take them to a ball game at Yankee Stadium. In the next few days, the suspense had grown all but intolerable until it threatened to spoil everything on the morning of the trip. He very nearly threw up his breakfast from tension and train sickness on the way to town. And might have done it in the taxi, too, if they hadn't gotten out to walk the last several blocks in the fresh air. But with the clearing of his head as they walked, it began to seem that everything was going to be fine. "There," his father said when they'd crossed the street. "Now here's the barber shop. That's where we're going for our haircuts in a minute. And here's the subway. See how they built the subway entrance right into the building? And look over here. This is the display room. These windows run the entire length of the building from here on. Lot bigger than our dinky old showroom out home, isn't it? And look, these are just a few of the products we make. Here's your typewriters, of course, and your adders and calculators and some of your different kinds of filing systems. And that's one of the new bookkeeping machines back there in the corner. And then look over here in the next window. These are your punched card machines. That big one is your tabulator, and the little one beside it is your sorter. When you watch a demonstration of that baby, it's really a sight to see. Fella takes a deck of punched cards, stacks them, puts them in there, and presses a button. And those old cards go flying through their lickety-split. But Frank's eyes kept wandering from the machines to his own reflection in the plate glass. He thought he looked surprisingly dignified in his new suit, with its coat and tie almost exactly like his father's, and it pleased him to see this bright image of the two of them, man and boy, with the endless swarm of people moving past on the sidewalk behind them. After a minute he backed several steps away and looked straight up until his collar cramped the back of his neck, and wow! He would admit he'd hoped for a skyscraper, but the last of his disappointment was vanishing now in this one long look. Up and up and up the tiers of windows rose, each smaller and more foreshortened than the one beneath, until their ever-narrowing sills and lintels seemed to merge. Imagine falling from the very top floor. Then he saw that the high cornice was moving slowly and steadily forward against the sky. The building was falling over on them, but there was no time for panic before he saw his mistake. It was the sky that moved, white clouds floating back over the ledge of the roof, and at the instant his mind came into focus on this fact, he felt a shiver of wonder down his spine at the enormous granite strength and stillness of the building. All set? His father was saying. Let's go to the barber's then and get fixed up, and then we'll go on inside. We're going to ride the elevator all the way to the top. But as things turned out, that preliminary moment on the sidewalk was the high point of the day. The barber shop proved to be nice enough, and so did the echoing marble-flagged lobby, which smelled of cigars and umbrellas and ladies' perfume. But from there on, the pleasures of the day began to dwindle steadily. The elevator gave no sense of flight, for one thing, but only of confinement and nausea. Of the office itself, the top floor, he remembered only an acre of white lights and a very thin lady whose open-work blouse revealed an incredible number of straps that were apparently connected with her underwear, who called him Sonny and showed him how the water cooler worked. Look, Sonny, watch the big bubble come up when I press the button. Blurp. Isn't that funny? Here, you try it. And he would never forget the instantaneous revulsion he felt in the presence of Mr. Oatfields, who, if not the biggest, was certainly the fattest man he had ever seen. Oatfields's glasses mirrored staring images of the office lights, so that you couldn't see what his eyes were doing when he talked to you, and he talked in a very loud voice without seeming to hear your replies. Well, aren't you a big fella? What's your name, huh? You like school? Well, that's fine. You like baseball, huh? The worst part of him was his mouth, which was so wet that a dozen shining strands of spittle clung and trembled between his moving lips. And it was this as much as anything that hampered Frank's enjoyment of the lunch, or luncheon, which took place in the restaurant of a great hotel. Oatfield's mouth did not close while chewing, and it left white streaks of food on the rim of his water glass. Once he softened the hard crust of a roll by holding it submerged in the gravy boat for some time before he lifted it to his reaching lips, allowing part of it to fall and leave a bright tan stain on his vest. You're absolutely right, Oat, Earl Wheeler kept saying throughout the meal, and I certainly do agree with you on that. And the few times he glanced at Frank, it was with startled eyes, as if surprised to find him sitting there. The ball game was a letdown, too. Nobody hit a home run, and in Frank's limited knowledge of the game, a home run was all that mattered. For the last hour of it, the sun slanted straight in his eyes, giving him a headache, and he had to go to the bathroom, but didn't know how to broach the subject. Then came the grimy ordeal of subway connections to Penn Station, during which his father took him angrily to task for having failed to say, "Thank you, I had a very nice time," to Oatfields. In the bleak light of the train shed, as they stood waiting for the gates to open, he stared unnoticed at the physical exhaustion and moral defeat in his father's face, which looked loose and porous and very old. Then, lowering his eyes, he discovered that his father's trouser leg was slightly and rhythmically twitching with the anxious movement of his pocketed fingers on his genitals. And that ultimately would become his most vivid single remembrance of the day. At the time, though, later that same night, as he staggered and crouched barefoot in his tilting, oddly shrunken bathroom of his home, it was his memory's vision of Oatfield's eating mouth that made the spasms of vomiting come again and again. Not until years later was he able to piece the simple facts of the case together. Earl Wheeler, having clung to an assistant branch managership in Newark through any number of depression layoffs and cutbacks, had somehow come to home office attention as a candidate for the job of right-hand man to Oatfields. And not until later still did he guess the explanation of that name, the fact that in a world of mandatory diminutives, a corporation of Jolly Bills and Jacks and Herbs and Teds, in which an unabbreviable given name like Earl must always have been a minor handicap, Oat was the best that could be done for a man with the given name of Otis. But the promotion had fallen through. Higher authority had decreed that Oatfields could get along without a right hand man, and Earl Wheeler must either have learned or guessed this outcome at some point during the luncheon or the ball game. And whether or not he ever came to accept the disappointment, Frank knew that to the end of his life he never understood it. It must, for that matter, have been the first of many events that passed Earl Wheeler's understanding, for it came at the beginning of his decline. And the years after that he was transferred from one field assignment to another until his retirement soon after the war, and not long after Oatfield's own retirement and death, by which time he had slipped from the assistant manager level to that of an ordinary salesman in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And in those years too, with increasing bewilderment, he had failed to understand the weakening of his health, the rapid, difficult aging of his wife, the indifference of his two older sons, and finally the shrill rebellion, the desertion, and the moral collapse of his youngest. A longshoreman, a cafeteria cashier, an ungrateful, spiteful, foul-mouthed weakling boozing his way through Greenwich Village with God only knew what kind of companions. A punk kid with no more sense of decency than to drive his mother nearly out of her mind, not writing for 8 months and then mailing a letter with no return address in the postscript. Got married last week. Might bring her out sometime. It was a lucky thing for Earl Wheeler then that he wasn't present in a cheap bar near the Columbia campus one noontime in 1948, when his son sat in conference with another slouching youth named Sam, a graduate student in philosophy who held a part-time job in the student placement office. So what's the problem, Frank? I thought you'd be back in Europe by now. Big joke. April's knocked up. Oh, Jesus. No, but listen, there are there are all different kinds of ways of looking at this thing, of looking at a thing like this, Sam. Look at it this way. I need a job, okay? Is that any reason why the job I get has to louse me up? Look, all I want is to get enough dough coming in to keep us solvent for the next year or so till I can figure things out. Meanwhile, I want to retain my own identity. Therefore, the thing I'm most anxious to avoid is any kind of work that can be considered interesting in its own right. I want something that can't possibly touch me. I want some big, swollen, old corporation that's been bumbling along making money in its sleep for 100 years, where they have to hire 8 guys for every one job because none of them can be expected to care about whatever boring thing it is they're supposed to be doing. I want to go into that kind of place and say, look, you can have my body and my nice college boy smile for so many hours a day in exchange for so many dollars. And beyond that, we'll leave each other strictly alone. Get the picture? I think so, said the philosophy student. Come on back to the office. And there, adjusting his glasses and thumbing through a card index, Sam began to write out a list of companies that seemed to fit the picture. A great copper and brass manufacturer, a great public utility, a gigantic firm that made all kinds of paper bags. But when Frank saw the awesome name of Knox Business Machines being added to the list, he thought there must be some mistake. Hey, no, wait a minute. I know that can't be right. And he gave a brief oral summary of his father's career, which caused the philosophy student to enjoy a pleasant chuckle. I think you'll find things have changed a little since your old man's time, Frank, he said. That was the Depression, don't forget. Besides, he was out in the field, you be in the home office. As a matter of fact, this place is just what you're looking for. I happen to know they've got guys sitting around that building that never lift a finger except to pick up their checks. I'd certainly mention your father, though, when you go for the interview. Probably help things along. But Frank, as he walked into the shadow of the Knox building with the ghosts of that other visit crowding his head, better take my hand here, this is a bad crossing, decided it would be more fun not to mention his father in the interview at all. And he didn't, and he got a job that very day on the 15th floor in something called the Sales Promotion Department. The sales what? April inquired. Promotion? I don't get it. What does that mean you're supposed to do? Who the hell knows? They explained it to me for half an hour and I still don't know, and I don't think they do either. No, but it's pretty funny, isn't it? Old Knox business machines. Wait till I tell the old man. Wait till he hears I didn't even use his name. And so it started as a kind of joke. Others might fail to see the humor of it, but it filled Frank Wheeler with a secret, astringent delight as he discharged his lazy duties, walking around the office in a way that had lately become almost habitual with him, if not quite truly characteristic, since having been described by his wife as terrifically sexy, a slow, cat like stride, proudly muscular but expressing a sleepy disdain of tension or hurry. And the best part of the joke was what happened every afternoon at 5. Buttoned up and smiling among the Knox men, nodding good night as the elevator set him free, he would take a crosstown bus and a downtown bus to Bethune Street, where he'd mount 2 flights of slope-treaded, creaking stairs, open a white door so overlaid with many generations of soiled and blistered paint that its surface felt like the flesh of a toadstool, and let himself into a wide, clean room that smelled faintly of cigarettes and candle wax, and tangerine peel, and eau de cologne. And there a beautiful, disheveled girl would be waiting. A girl as totally unlike the wife of a Knox man as the apartment was unlike a Knox man's home. Instead of after-work cocktails, they would make after-work love, sometimes on the bed and sometimes on the floor. Sometimes it was 10 o'clock before they roused themselves and strolled into the gentle evening streets for dinner, and by then the Knox building could have been 1,000 miles away. By the end of the first year, the joke had worn thin, and the inability of the others to see the humor of it had become depressing. "Oh, you mean your father worked there?" they would say when he tried to explain it. And their eyes, as often as not, would then begin to film over with the look that people reserve for earnest, obedient, unadventurous young men. Before long, and particularly after the second year, with both his parents dead, he had stopped trying to explain that part of it, and begun to dwell instead on other cosmic aspects of the job. The absurd discrepancy between his own ideals and those of Knox business machines. The gulf between the amount of energy he was supposed to give the company and the amount he actually gave. I mean, the great advantage of a place like Knox is that you can sort of turn off your mind every morning at 9 and leave it off all day, and nobody knows the difference. More recently still, and particularly since moving to the country, he had taken to avoiding the whole topic whenever possible by replying, to the question of what he did for a living, that he didn't do anything, really, that he had the dullest job you could possibly imagine. On the Monday morning after the end of the Laurel Players, he walked into the Knox building like an automaton. The show windows were featuring a new display, bright cardboard images of thin, fashionable young women who grinned and pointed their pencils at emblazoned lists of product benefits: speed, accuracy, control. And beyond them, across the deep carpeted expanse of the display floor, a generous sampling of the products themselves stood poised for demonstration. Some of them, the simpler ones, were much like the machines that had kindled his father's enthusiasm 20 years before, though the angular black designs of those days had all been modified to fit the globular sculptured forms of their new casings, which were the color of oyster meat. But there were others equipped to deal with the facts of business at speeds more lickety-split than anything Earl Wheeler could have dreamed of. These, ready to purr and blink with electronic mystery, grew more and more imposing across the floor, until they culminated in the big, inscrutable components of the Knox 500 electronic computer, a machine which, according to the museum card displayed at its base, could perform the lifetime work of a man with a desk calculator in 30 minutes. But Frank moved past the display room without a glance, and his actions on entering the lobby were absent-mindedly expert. He obeyed the pointed finger of the elevator starter without quite being aware of it, nor did he notice which of the 6 elevator operators it was who sleepily made him welcome. He almost never did, unless it happened to be one of the 2 whose presence could be faintly oppressive. The very old man whose knees were so sprung that painful-looking bulges pressed against the backs of his trousers, or the enormous boy whom some glandular disorder had afflicted with the high hips of a woman and the downy head and beardless face of an infant. Pressed well back in the polite bondage of the car, he heard the sliding door clamp shut and the safety gate go rattling after it. And as the car began to rise, he was surrounded by the dissonant conversations of his colleagues. He heard a deep, measured voice of the Great Plains, rich with distance and travel and the best accommodations. Course, we did hit a little bumpy weather coming into Chicago. Sound out in counterpoint to the abrupt and sibilant accents of the city. So I says, "What you kiddin'?" No, says, "No, listen, I'm not kiddin'." While a softer melody of 8 or 10 voices, male and female, repeated their hushed morning courtesies under the buzz of the overhead fan. Then it was time to begin the nodding, sidestepping ritual of making way for the people who edged toward the front with murmurs of out please, and to wait while the doors slid open and shut again. The 8th, the 11th, the 12th, the 14th. At first glance, all the upper floors of the Knox building looked alike. Each was a big open room, ablaze with fluorescent ceiling lights that had been divided into a maze of aisles and cubicles by shoulder-high partitions. The upper panels of these dividers, waist to shoulder, were made of thick, unframed plate glass that was slightly corrugated to achieve a blue-white semi-transparency. And the overall effect to a man getting off the elevator and looking out across the room, was that of the wide indoor lake in which swimmers far and near were moving, some making steady headway, some treading water, others seen in the act of breaking to the surface or going under, and many submerged, their faces loosened into wavering pink blurs as they drowned at their desks. But the illusion was quickly dispelled on walking further into the office, for here the air was of an overwhelming dryness. It was, as Frank Wheeler often complained, enough to dry your goddamned eyeballs out. For all his complaints, though, he was sometimes guiltily aware of taking a dim pleasure in the very discomfort of the office. When he said, as he'd been saying for years, that in a funny way he guessed he would miss old Knox when he quit, he meant, of course, that it was the people he would miss. I mean, hell, they're a pretty decent crowd, some of them anyway. And yet, in all honesty, he could not have denied a homely affection for the place itself, the 15th floor. Over the years, he had discovered slight sensory distinctions between it and all the others of the building. It was no more or less pleasant, but different for being his floor. It was his bright, dry, daily ordeal, his personal measure of tedium. It had taught him new ways of spacing out the hours of the day. Almost time to go down for coffee. Almost time to go out for lunch. Almost time to go home. And he had come to rely on the desolate wastes of time that lay between these pleasures as an invalid comes to rely on the certainty of recurring pain. It was a part of him. "Morning, Frank," said Vince Lathrop. "Morning, Frank," said Ed Small. "Morning, Mr. Wheeler," said Grace Mancuso, who worked for Herb Underwood in market research. His feet knew where to turn at the aisle marked sales promotion, and they knew how many steps would bring him past the first 3 cubicles and where he would have to turn again to enter the 4th. He could have done it in his sleep. "Hello," said Maureen Grube, who served as floor receptionist and worked in Mrs. Jorgensen's typing pool. She said it in a frankly flattering, definitely feminine way, and as she swayed aside to let him pass, he wanted to put his arm around her and lead her away somewhere. The mailroom, the freight elevator, where he could sit down and take her on his lap and remove her royal blue sweater and fill his mouth with one and then the other of her breasts. It wasn't the first time this idea had occurred to him. The difference was that this time it had no sooner occurred to him than he thought, why not? His feet had led him to the entrance of the cubicle whose plastic nameplate read, J. R. Ordway, F. H. Wheeler, and he paused there, one hand hooked over the rim of the plate glass, to turn and look back at her. She was all the way down to the end of the aisle now, her buttocks moving nicely in her flannel skirt, and he watched her until she disappeared beneath the waterline of partition tops to take her place at the reception desk. Take it easy, he counseled himself. A thing like this would need a little planning. The first thing to do, he knew, was to go on inside and say good morning to Jack Ordway, and take off his coat and sit down. He did that, instantly shutting out his view of everything beyond the cubicle walls. And as he settled himself sideways at his desk, with the right foot automatically toeing open a lower drawer and using its edge as a footrest, the pressure of his shoe over the years had worn a little saddle in the edge of that particular drawer. He allowed a slow wave of delight to break over him. Why not? Hadn't she given him every possible encouragement for months? Undulating past him in the aisle like that, bending close over his desk to hand him a folder, smiling in a special oblique way that he'd never seen her use on anyone else. And that time at the Christmas party, he could still remember the taste of her mouth. Hadn't she trembled in his arms, and hadn't she whispered, "You're sweet"? Why not? Oh, not in the mailroom or the freight elevator, but didn't she probably have an apartment somewhere? With a roommate, and wouldn't the roommate probably be out all day? Jack Ordway was talking to him, requiring him against his will to look up and say, "What's that?" An intrusion by almost anyone else wouldn't have mattered. He could have nodded and made the right replies while keeping most of his mind free for Maureen Grube. But Ordway was different. "I said I'm gonna need your help this morning, Franklin," he was saying. "This is an emergency. I'm dead serious, old scout." He was apparently studying a sheaf of typewritten papers on his desk, the picture of concentration. Only someone who knew what to look for could have told that the hand which seemed to be shading his eyes was really holding his head up, and that his eyes were shut. In his early 40s, slight and trim, with the graying hair and wittily handsome face of a romantic actor, he was the kind of borderline alcoholic whose salvation seems to lie in endless renewals of his ability to laugh the whole thing off. And he was the sentimental hero of the office. Everybody loved Jack Ordway. Today he was wearing his English suit, the suit he had ordered from a touring London tailor some years before, at the cost of half a month's salary. The suit whose cuff buttons really buttoned and whose high-backed trousers could only be worn with suspenders or braces. The suit that was never seen without a fresh linen handkerchief spilling from its breast pocket. But his long, narrow feet, which lay splayed with childish awkwardness under the desk, betrayed a pitifully all-American look. They were encased in cheap orange-brown loafers, badly scuffed. And the reason for this clashing note was that the one thing Jack Ordway could not do in the grip of a really bad hangover was to tie a pair of shoelaces. "For the next," he was saying in a hoarse, unsteady voice, "for the next 2 or possibly 3 hours, you're to warn me of Bandy's every approach. You're to protect me from Mrs. Jorgensen, and you may have to screen me from public view in case I begin to throw up. It's that bad." The capsuled story of Jack Ordway's life had become a minor legend of the 15th floor. Everyone knew of how he'd married a rich girl and lived on her inheritance until it vanished just before the war. How since then his business career had been spent entirely in the Knox building, in one glass cubicle after another, and how it had been distinguished by an almost flawless lack of work. Even here in sales promotion, where nobody worked very hard except old Bandy, the manager, he had managed to retain his unique reputation. Except when a really bad hangover laid him low, he was up and around and talking all day, setting off little choruses of laughter wherever he went, sometimes even winning a tolerant chuckle from Bandy himself, driving Mrs. Jorgensen into fits of helpless giggles that made her weep. "First of all," he was saying now, "on Saturday these crazy friends of Sally's flew in from the coast, all eager for the treat. Could we show them the town? Oh, indeed we could. Old buddies of hers and all that, and besides, they always bring pocketfuls of loot. So, started off with lunch at Andre's, and dear God, you've never seen such whopping great martinis in your life. Oh, and none of the sissy business of one or two apiece either, buddy. I lost count. And then, let's see. Oh, yes. Then there was nothing to do but sit around and drink until cocktail time. Then came cocktail time. He had abandoned his working posture now, pushed the false papers aside, and leaned delicately in the back in the chair to hold his head with both hands. He was moving it from side to side in the rhythm of his narrative, laughing and talking through his laughter, while Frank watched him with a mixture of pity and distaste. Most of his hangover stories seemed to begin with a flying in of Sally's crazy friends from the coast, or from the Bahamas, or from Europe, with pocketfuls of loot, and Sally herself was always featured at the center of the fun. The former debutante, the chic, childless wife and irrepressible playmate. That at least was the way his listeners on the 15th floor were expected to picture her. Frank had been able to do so and to picture their apartment as a kind of Noel Coward stage setting, until the time he went home with Ordway for a drink and found that Sally was massively soft and wrinkled, a sodden, aging woman with lips forever painted in the petulant Cupid's bow of her youth. Her every whining intonation of Jack's name that night, as she swayed, bewildered, through rooms of rotting leather and dusty silver and glass, showed how deeply she blamed him for allowing the world to collapse. Once she had turned up her eyes to the paint-flaked ceiling as if calling on God to punish him, this weak, foolish little man for whom she'd sacrificed her very life, who poisoned all her friendships with his endless counting of pennies, who insisted on grubbing at his dreary, dreary white-collar job and bringing dreary office people home with him. And Jack, apologetically hovering and making little jokes, had called her mother. And as for how we got back from Idlewild, he was saying, it's a thing I'll never know. My last completely clear recollection is of standing in the Idlewild lounge at 3 o'clock this morning and wondering if someone would please tell me how we'd gotten there in the first place. Or no, wait. After that, there was something about a hamburger joint. Or no, I think that was earlier. When the story was over, at last he removed his hands from his head, experimentally, and frowned and blinked several times. Then he announced that he was beginning to feel a little better. Good. Frank dropped his foot from the drawer and got settled at his desk. He had to think. And the best way to think was to go through the motions of working. This morning's batch of papers was waiting in his in basket on top of last Friday's, and so his first action was to turn the whole stack upside down on his desk and start from the bottom. As he did each day, or rather on the days when he bothered with the in basket, for there were many days when he left it alone, he tried first to see how many papers he could get rid of without actually reading their contents. Some could be thrown away, others could be almost rapidly disposed of by scrawling, "What about this?" in their margins with his initials, and sending them to Bandy, or by writing, "Know anything about this?" and sending them to someone like Ed Small next door. But the danger here was that the same papers might come back in a few days marked "Do" from Bandy and "No" from Small. A safer course was to mark a thing "File" for Mrs. Jorgensen and the girls, after the briefest possible glance had established that it wasn't of urgent importance. If it was, he might mark it "File and Follow" 1 week, or he might put it aside and go on to the next one. The gradual accumulation of papers put aside in this way was what he turned to as soon as he was finished with or tired of the in basket. Arranging them in an approximate order of importance, he would interleave them in the same order with those of the 6 or 8 inch stack that always lay near the center of the desk, held down by a glazed ceramic paperweight that Jennifer had made for him in kindergarten. This was his current work pile. Many of the papers in it bore the insignia of Bandy's "Do" or Ed Small's "No," and some had been through the file and follow cycle as many as 3 or 4 times. Some bearing notes like "Frank might look into this," were the gifts of men who used him as he used Small. Occasionally, he would remove a piece of current work and place it in the equally high secondary pile that lay on the far right hand corner of the desk, under a leaden scale model of the Knox 500 electronic computer. This was the pile of things he couldn't bring himself to face just now, and the worst of them. Sometimes whole bulging folders filled with scrawled over typewritten sheets and loose sliding paper clips would eventually go into the stuffed bottom right hand drawer of the desk. The papers in there were of the kind that Ordway called real goodies, and that drawer opposite to the one that served as a footrest had come to occupy a small nagging place in Frank's conscience. He was as shy of opening it as if it held live snakes. Why not? Wouldn't it be perfectly easy to walk up and ask her out to lunch? No, it wouldn't. That was the trouble. An unspoken rule of the 15th floor divided the men from the girls on all but business matters, except at Christmas parties. The girls made separate arrangements for lunch in the same invaluable way that they used a separate lavatory, and only a fool would openly defy the system. This would need a little planning. He was still in the middle of the in basket when a thin, smiling face and a round, solemn one appeared above the glass wall, looking in from the next cubicle. They were the faces of Vince Lathrop and Ed Small, and this meant it was time to go down for coffee. "Gentlemen," said Vince Lathrop, "shall we dance?" Half an hour later, they were back in the office, having heard at some length about Ed Small's difficulties with grass seed and lawn care at Roslyn, Long Island. The coffee had helped to strengthen Ordway, though it was clear now that what he really needed was a drink. And to prove how much better he felt, he was pacing up and down the cubicle and going through his impersonation of Bandy, wobbling his head and repeatedly sucking at a side tooth with little kissing sounds. Well, but I wonder if we're really being effective. That's the thing. Because if we really want to be effective, then we're going to have to get in there and be more effective. Frank was trying for the second or third time to read the top paper on his current work pile, which seemed to be a letter from the branch manager in Toledo, but its paragraphs were as opaque as if it had been typed in a foreign language. He closed his eyes and rubbed them and tried again, and this time he made it. The branch manager in Toledo, who in the Knox tradition referred to himself as "we," wished to know what action had been taken on his previous correspondence with regard to the many serious errors and misleading statements in SP 1109, a copy of which was attached. This proved to be a thick, coated stock, four-color brochure entitled "Pinpoint Your Production Control with the Knox 500," and the sight of it brought back uneasy memories. It had been produced many months before by a nameless copywriter in an agency that had since lost its Knox account and had been released to the field in tens of thousands of copies marked "Address All Inquiries, F. H. Wheeler, Home Office." Frank had known at the time that it was a mess. Its densely printed pages defied simple logic, as well as readership, and its illustrations were only sporadically related to its text. But he'd let it go anyway, chiefly because Bandy had confronted him in the aisle one day with a kiss of the side tooth and said, "Haven't we released that brochure yet?" Since then, the inquiries addressed to F. H. Wheeler had come in slow, embarrassing streams from all parts of the United States, and he was dimly aware of something particularly urgent about those that had been coming from Toledo. The next paragraph reminded him, "As you will recall, it was our intention to order 5,000 additional copies of the brochure for distribution at the annual NAPE convention, National Association of Production Executives, here June 10 through the 13th. However, as stated in previous correspondence, the brochure is in our opinion as inferior, that it does not fulfill its purpose in any way, shape, or manner. Therefore, please advise immediately our inquiry in previous correspondence, namely, what arrangements are being made to have a revised version of the brochure in our office not later than June 8th in the required number of copies?" He looked quickly at the upper left-hand corner and was relieved to find that the letter had not carried a carbon to Bandy. That was a piece of luck. But even so, this had all the earmarks of a real goodie. Even if there were still time to arrange for a new brochure to be produced, and there probably wasn't, he would have to clear the job through Bandy, and Bandy would want to know why he hadn't been told about it 2 months earlier. He was in the act of laying the thing on his secondary pile when the beginnings of a bright idea came through his confusion. And suddenly he was out of the cubicle and walking toward the front of the office with his heart in his mouth. She was at her desk in the reception area with nothing to do, and when she looked up, her eyes were so full of pleased expectancy, of complicity, it almost seemed, that he nearly forgot what it was he had to pretend he'd come for. "Maureen," he said, moving up close and taking hold of the back of her chair, "if you're not too busy here, I wonder if you'd help me find some stuff in the central file. You see this?" He laid the brochure on her desk as if it were an intimate revelation, and she leaned forward from the hips to examine it, so that her breast swung close to his pointing hand. "Hmm? The thing is, it's got to be revised. That means I've got to dig up all the material that went into it right from scratch. Now, if you'll look in the inactive file under SP 1109, you'll find copies of all the stuff we sent to the agency. Then if you check each of those papers, you'll find another code number referring you to the other files. That way we can trace the thing back to original sources. Come on, I'll help you get started." "All right." As he moved up the aisle behind her hips, he felt the promise of triumph in his expanding chest, and soon they were alone together in the labyrinth of the central file, enveloped in her perfume as they fingered nervously through a drawer of folders. 11 what did you say? 1109 should be right here, right there somewhere. For the first time, he allowed himself to scrutinize her face. It was round and wide-nosed and not really very pretty. He could afford to admit that now. And its too heavy makeup was probably there to hide a bad complexion, just as the little black tails she had drawn at the corners of her eyes were there to make the eyes look larger and farther apart. Her carefully arranged hair was probably her greatest problem. It must have been a shapeless, frizzled bush when she was a child, and must still give her trouble in the rain. But her mouth was wonderful. Perfect teeth and plump, subtly shaped lips that had the texture of marzipan. He found that if he focused his eyes on her mouth so that the rest of her face was slightly blurred, and then drew back to include the whole length and shape of her in that hazy image, it was possible to believe he was looking at the most desirable woman in the world. "Here," she said. "Now, you want all the folders relating to all these other code numbers? Is that it?" "That's it. It may take a little time. I hope you weren't planning on an early lunch." "No, I didn't have any special plans." "Good. I'll stop back in a while and see how you're doing. Thanks a lot, Maureen." "You're very welcome." And he went back to his cubicle and sat down. It was a perfect arrangement. He could wait here until the rest of the floor had emptied out for lunch. Then he would go back and get her. His only problem now was to think up an excuse for not going out to lunch in the usual way with the usual crowd. An excuse, if possible, that would cover him for the rest of the afternoon. "Eat?" a deep, masculine voice inquired, and this time 3 heads hung above the partition. They were the heads of Lathrop Small and the man who had spoken, a gray mountain of a man with heavy eyebrows and a clenched pipe, whose bulk rose high enough above the glass to reveal that he wore a defiantly unbusinesslike checkered shirt, hairy wool tie, and pepper and salt jacket. This was Sid Roscoe, the literary and political sage of the 15th floor, a self-described old newspaper guy who contemptuously edited the employee house organ Knox News. "Come on, you characters," he said heartily. "On your feet." Jack Ordway obeyed him, pausing only to murmur, "Ready, Franklin?" But Frank held back, inspecting his watch with the look of a man pressed for time. "Guess I won't be able to make it today," he said. "Got some people to see uptown this afternoon. I'll probably stop for a bite up there." "Oh, for God's sake, Wheeler," Ordway said, turning on him. There was a disproportionate amount of shock and disappointment in his face, a look of But you gotta come with us. And it took Frank a second to realize what the trouble was. Ordway needed him. With Frank along for moral support, it would be possible to steer the group to what Ordway called the nice place, the dark German restaurant where a round of weak but adequate martinis came floating to your table almost as a matter of course. Without him, under Roscoe's leadership, they would almost certainly go to the awful place, a bright, mercilessly clean luncheonette called Waffle Haven, where you couldn't even get a glass of beer and where the cloying smells of melting butter and maple syrup were enough to make you retch into your tiny paper napkin. There would then be nothing for Jack Ordway to do but sit and hold himself together until they brought him back to the office, and set him free to slip out again for the couple of quick ones he would need to survive the afternoon. "Please," his comically round eyes implored as they led him away, "please don't let this happen to me." But Frank sat firm, thumbing the edges of his current work file. He waited until they were safely in the elevator, and then he continued to wait. 10 minutes went by, and 20, and still the office seemed much too crowded. Then, at last, he half rose from his chair and peeked out over the surface of the partition tops in all directions. Maureen's head moved alone above the waterline of the central file. There were a few other heads bunched near the elevators and a few others scattered in far corners, but there was no point in waiting any longer. The office would never be emptier than this. He buttoned his coat and stalked out of the cubicle. "That's fine, Maureen," he said, bearing down on her and taking the batch of folders and papers from her hand. "I don't think we'll need any more than that." "Well, but it's only about half the stuff, though. I mean, didn't you want all of it?" "Tell you what, let's not worry about it. How about some lunch?" "All right, I'd love to." He was all action as he hurried back to his desk to drop the papers and dodged into the men's room to wash up. But when he went to stand by the elevators waiting for her to come out of the ladies' room, he was all worry. The small crowd around the elevators was beginning to include people coming back from lunch. If she didn't hurry up, they might run into Ordway and the others. What the hell was she doing in there? Standing with her arms around three other girls in a paralysis of laughter at the very idea of going out with Mr. Wheeler? Then suddenly she was walking toward him in a light coat, and the elevator door was sliding open, and the operator's voice was saying, "Down." He stood a little behind her and held himself in a rigid parade rest as they dropped through space. All the restaurants for blocks around would be loaded with Knox people. He would have to get her out of the neighborhood, and as they moved through the lobby, he touched her elbow as hesitantly as if it were her breast. "Listen," he mumbled, "there aren't any decent places to eat around here. You mind taking a short trip?" They were out on the sidewalk now, jostled by the crowd, and he stood smiling like an idiot for what seemed a full minute of indecision before the word taxi popped into his head. Then all at once it made him feel so fine to see one slowing down under the command of his wagging arm, and so splendid to see her smile and bend and climb gracefully into its deep seat, that he didn't give a damn about what he saw from the corner of his eye at that moment. The unmistakable bulk of Sid Roscoe in the crowd, flanked by the familiar shapes of Lathrop and Small and Ordway, coming from the direction of the awful place. It was impossible to tell whether they'd seen him or not, and he instantly decided that it didn't matter. He slammed the door and allowed himself one more glance through the window of the cab as it pulled away from the curb, and he wanted to laugh aloud at the sight of Jack Ordway's orange loafers flapping along through the forest of legs and feet. "Everything's sort of going out of focus," she said. "I mean, I feel fine and everything, but I guess we better eat something." They were in an expensive brick-walled restaurant on West 10th Street, and Maureen had talked for half an hour in a breathless autobiographical rush, pausing only once to let him telephone Mrs. Jorgensen and arrange for one of the other girls to take the reception desk for the afternoon. "The thing is," he had explained, "I had to borrow Maureen to help me locate some stuff here in the visual aids, and it looks like we're going to be tied up here for the rest of the day." There was no department or sub-department anywhere in the Knox building called visual aids, but he was reasonably sure that Mrs. Jorgensen didn't know it, and that anyone she'd be likely to ask would not be certain either. He had handled the call so adroitly that he didn't realize how close he was to being drunk until he came within an inch of upsetting a tray of French pastries on his way back from the telephone booth. The rest of his time had been devoted to steady drinking and listening, with mixed emotions. These were some of the things he'd learned: that she was 22 and came from a town far upstate where her father owned a hardware store, that she hated her name. I mean, Maureen's all right, but Groob sounds so awful with it. I guess that was one reason I was so crazy to get married. That she'd been married at 18 and had it annulled 6 months later. It was completely ridiculous, and had spent the following year or two just moping around home and working at the gas company and feeling depressed. Until it struck her that what she'd always really and truly wanted to do was come to New York and live. All this was pleasing, and so was the way she had shyly slipped into calling him Frank. And so was the news that she did indeed have an apartment with another girl, a perfectly adorable apartment right here in the village. But after a while he found he had to keep reminding himself to be pleased. The trouble, he guessed, was mainly that she talked too much. It was also that so much of her talk rang false, that so many of its possibilities for charm were blocked and buried under the stylized ceremony of its cuteness. Soon he was able to guess that most, if not all, of her inanity could be blamed on her roommate, whose name was Norma and for whom she seemed to feel unqualified admiration. The more she told him about this other girl, or gal, that she was older and twice divorced, that she worked for a big magazine and knew all sorts of fabulous people, the more annoyingly clear it became that she and Norma enjoyed classic roles of mentor and novice in an all-girl orthodoxy of fun. There were signs of this tutelage in Maureen's too heavy makeup and too careful hairdo, as well as in her every studied mannerism and prattling phrase, her overuse of words like mad and fabulous and appalling, her wide-eyed recitals of facts concerning apartment maintenance, and her endless supply of anecdotes involving sweet little Italian grocers and sweet little Chinese laundrymen and gruff but lovable cops on the beat, all of whom, in the telling, became the stock supporting actors in a confectionery Hollywood romance of bachelor girls in Manhattan. Under the oppressive weight of this outpouring he had called for round after round of drinks, and now her meek announcement that everything was sort of out of focus filled him with guilt. All Norma's brittle animation had fled from Maureen's face. She looked as honest and as helpless as a child about to be sick on her party dress. He called the waiter and helped her to choose the most wholesome items on the menu with all the care of a conscientious father. And when she had settled down to eat, looking up now and then to assure him that she felt much better, it was his turn to talk. He made the most of it. Sentences poured from him. Paragraphs composed themselves and took wing. Appropriate anecdotes sprang to his service and fell back to make way for the stately passage of epigrams. Beginning with a quick, audacious dismantling of the Knox Business Machines Corporation, which made her laugh, he moved out confidently onto broader fields of damnation, until he had laid the punctured myth of free enterprise at her feet. Then, just at the point where any further talk of economics might have threatened to bore her, he swept her away into cloudy realms of philosophy, and brought her lightly back to earth with a wisecrack. And how did she feel about the death of Dylan Thomas? And didn't she agree that this generation was the least vital and most terrified in modern times? He was at the top of his form. He was making use of material that had caused Millie Campbell to say, "Oh, that's so true, Frank," and of older, richer stuff that had once helped to make him the most interesting person April Johnson had ever met. He even touched on his having been a longshoreman. Through it all, though, ran a bright and skillfully woven thread that was just for Maureen, a portrait of himself as decent, but delusioned young family man, sadly and bravely at war with his environment. By the time the coffee came, he could see that it was all taking effect. Her face had become an automatic register of quick responses to everything he said. He could make it leap into delighted laughter or frown and nod in solemn agreement, or soften into romantic contemplation. If he'd wanted to, he could very easily have made it weep. When she looked briefly away from him, down at her cup, or off misty eyed into the room, it was only for a kind of emotional catching of breath. Once he could have sworn he saw her planning how she would tell Norma about him tonight. Oh, the most fascinating man. And the way she seemed to melt when he helped her on with her coat, the way she swayed against him as they walked out of the place for a stroll in the sunshine, made it clear that the last shred of doubt could be safely abandoned. He had it made. The only problem now was where to go. They were heading vaguely toward the trees of Washington Square, and the trouble with taking a walk in the park, aside from its waste of valuable time, was that this was the hour when the park would be full of women who had once been April's friends and neighbors. Anne Snyder and Susan Cross, and God only knew how many others would be there, lifting their softening cheeks to the sun or wiping ice cream from the mouths of their children as they talked of nursery schools and outrageous rents and perfectly marvelous Japanese movies, waiting until it was time to gather up their toys and graham crackers and stroll home to fix their husbands' cocktails. And they'd spot him in a minute. Well, of course it's Frank Wheeler, but who's that with him? Isn't that funny? But he had scarcely allowed this uneasiness to develop before Maureen came to a stop on the sidewalk. "This is my place. Would you like to come up for a drink or something?" Then he was following her hips up a dim, carpeted stairway, and then a door had clicked shut behind him, and he was standing in a room that smelled of vacuum cleaning and breakfast bacon and perfume. A high, silent room where everything lay richly bathed in yellow light from windows whose blinds of split bamboo had turned the sun into fine horizontal stripes of tan and gold. He stood feeling tall and strong as she ducked and curtsied around him in her stockinged feet, straightening ashtrays and magazines. "I'm afraid the place is an awful mess. Won't you sit down?" And when she sank one knee into a studio couch to reach across it for the cord that opened one of the blinds, he moved up close behind her and put his hand on her waist. That was all it took. With a moist little whimpering groan, she turned and pressed herself into his arms, offering up her mouth. Then they were on the couch, and the only problem in the world was the bondage of their clothing. Twisting and gasping together, they worked urgently at knots and buttons and buckles and hooks until the last impediment slipped away. And then in the warmth and rhythm of her flesh, he found an overwhelming sense of "this is what I needed. This is what I needed." His self-absorption was so complete that he was only dimly aware of her whispering, "Oh, yes, yes, yes." When it was over, though, when they had fallen apart and rejoined each other in a lightly sweating tangle of arms and legs, he knew he had never been more grateful to anyone in his life. The only trouble was that he couldn't think of anything to say. He tried to get a look at her face, give himself a clue, but she had clasped her head against his chest, so that all he could see was the black disorder of her hair. She was waiting for him to speak first. He rolled his head a little and found he was looking through a crooked opening of the window blind, which he had managed to raise a few inches before falling into his arms. He studied the weathered brick cornice of a house across the street, whose chimney pots and television aerials made intricate silhouettes against the vibrant blue of the sky. From somewhere high and far away came the faint crawling drone of a plane. He looked the other way into the room where everything, Picasso prints, Book of the Month Club selections, sling chair, mantelpiece bristling with snapshots, everything swam in the vivid yellow light. And his first consecutive thought was that his flung coat and shirt were lying over there, near the chair, and his shoes and pants and underwear were here, closer at hand. He could be up and dressed and out of this place in 30 seconds. "Well," he said at last, "I guess this wasn't exactly what you had in mind when you went to work this morning, was it?" The silence continued, so complete that he was aware for the first time of the ticking of an alarm clock in the next room. Then, "No," she said, "it certainly wasn't." And she quickly sat up. She groped for the royal blue sweater and snatched it up to cover herself. Then, hesitating, she seemed to decide that modesty could hardly be said to matter any more, and let it drop. But in a flurry of embarrassment, she picked it up again, evidently wondering if this wasn't exactly the kind of a time when modesty mattered most, and covered her breast with it again, and crossed her arms over it. Her hair was as unattractively wild now as it must have been in childhood. It seemed to have exploded upward from her skull into hundreds of little kinks. She touched it delicately with her fingertips in several places, not in any effort to smooth it, but rather in the furtive, half conscious way that he himself had sometimes touched his pimples at 16, just to make sure the horrible things were still there. Her face and neck were pale, but a deep red blush had begun to mottle both her cheeks as if she'd been slapped, and she looked so vulnerable that for a second or two he was certain he could read her thoughts. What would Norma say? Would Norma be appalled at her for having been so easy to get? No. Surely Norma's feeling would be that in a really adult, rather sophisticated affair, it was hopelessly banal to think in such terms as being easy or hard to get. Yes, but still, if it was as adult and sophisticated as all that, why couldn't she decide what to do with her sweater? Why was she having such an awful time thinking of what in the world she could possibly say to the man? Finally, she composed herself. She lifted her chin as if to toss back a smooth, heavy lock of hair and willed her face into a drawing room comedy smile, looking him straight in the eyes for the first time. Do you have a cigarette, Frank? Sure, here. And at last, mercifully, the dialogue began to flow. What was the name of that department you invented? Hmm? You know, the place you told her we'd be, Mrs. Jorgensen. Oh, visual aids. I didn't really invent it. There used to be something called that down on, I think, the 8th floor. Don't worry, though, she'll never figure it out. It does sound wonderfully real, visual aids. Excuse me a second, Frank. And she skittered across the apartment, crouching awkwardly as if that would make her less naked, into the room where the alarm clock ticked. When she came out wearing a floor-length dressing gown and with her hair almost completely restored to its former shape, she found him fully dressed and politely inspecting the snapshots on the mantelpiece, like a visitor who hasn't yet been asked to sit down. She showed him where the bathroom was, and when he came back, she had straightened up the couch and was moving indecisively around the kitchenette. Can I get you a drink or anything? No thanks, Maureen. Actually, I guess I'd better be cutting out. It's getting kind of late. Gee, that's right, it is. Have you missed your train? That's all right, I'll get the next one. It's a shame to. It's just. It's a shame you have to rush off. She seemed determined to be calm and dignified, and she carried it off with elegance until the moment of her opening the door for him, when her eyes strayed to the corner near the couch and discovered that something flimsy and white, a brassiere or a garter belt, had been overlooked in her straightening up, and still lay twisted on the carpet. She started visibly fighting an impulse to run over and grab it and stuff it behind the cushions, or possibly tear it to shreds. And when she turned back to him, her eyes were pitiably wide and bright. It couldn't be avoided. He would have to put something into words. But the only honest thing he could say was that he'd never felt more grateful to anyone, to thank her, and he wondered if this mightn't have exactly the wrong effect, almost as if he were offering her money. Another idea occurred to him. He could be sad and tender. He could take her by the shoulders and say, Look, Maureen, there can't be any future in a thing like this. But then she might say, Oh, I know, and hide her face in his coat, and that would leave him with nothing to say but, I don't want to think I've taken any kind of unfair advantage here. If I have, well, I'm. And that was the trouble. He would have to say, I'm sorry, and that's the last thing he wanted to do. The very last thing in God's world he wanted to do was apologize. Did the swan apologize to Lita? Did an eagle apologize? Did a lion apologize? Hell no. What he did instead was to smile at her, a subtle, worldly, attractive smile, and hold his face in that position until she falteringly smiled back. Then he bent and kissed her lightly on the lips and said, Listen, you are swell. Take care now. He was down the stairs and out on the street and walking. Before he'd gone half a block, he had broken into an exultant run, and he ran all the way to Fifth Avenue. Once he had to swerve to keep from stepping into a baby carriage, and a woman shouted, "Can't you watch where you're going?" But he refused. No less than an eagle or a lion would have refused to look back. He felt like a man. Could a man ride home in the rear smoker, primly adjusting his pants at the knees to protect their crease, and rattling his evening paper into a narrow panel to give his neighbor elbow room? Could a man sit meekly massaging his headache and allowing himself to be surrounded by the chatter of beaten, amiable husks of men who sat and swayed and played bridge, and a stagnant smell of newsprint and tobacco and bad breath and overheated radiators? Hell no. The way for a man to ride was erect and out in the open, out in the loud iron passageway where the wind whipped his necktie, standing with his feet set wide apart on the shuddering, clangoring floor plates, taking deep pulls from a pinched cigarette until its burning end was a needle of fire and quivering paper ash, and then snapping it straight as a bullet into the roaring speed of the roadbed, while the suburban towns wheeled slowly along the pink and gray dust of 7 o'clock. And when he came to his own station, the way for a man to alight was to swing down the iron steps and leap before the train had stopped, to land running and slow down to an easy athletic stride as he made for his parked automobile. The curtains were drawn in the picture window. He saw that from the road before he'd reached the driveway. Then, when he'd made the turn, he saw April come running from the kitchen door and stand waiting for him in the carport. She was wearing her black cocktail dress, ballet slippers, and a very small apron of crisp white gauze that he'd never seen before. And he'd barely had the time to switch off the ignition before she wrenched open the car and took hold of his forearm with both hands, talking. Her hands were thinner and more nervous than Maureen Group's. She was taller and older and used a completely different kind of perfume, and she spoke more rapidly in a higher-pitched voice. "Frank, listen. Before you come in, I've got to talk to you. It's terribly important." "What?" "Oh, so many things. First of all, I missed you all day, and I'm terribly sorry for everything, and I love you. The rest can wait. Now come on inside." If he'd had a year to devote to it and nothing else to do, he couldn't for the life of him have sorted out and weighed the emotions that filled him in the 2 or 3 seconds of his lumbering to the kitchen steps with April fastened to his arm. It was like walking through a sandstorm. It was like walking on the ocean floor. It was like walking on air. And this was the funny part. For all the depth of his bafflement, he couldn't help noticing that April's voice, different as it was, possessed a quality that made it oddly similar to Maureen Grube's voice, telling of the fabulous people Norma knew or saying visual aids, a quality of play acting, of slightly false intensity, a way of seeming to speak less to him than to some romantic abstraction. "Wait here, my darling," she was saying, "just for a minute till I call you." And she left him alone in the kitchen where the hot brown smell of roasting beef brought tears to his eyes. She handed him an old-fashioned glass full of ice and whiskey and disappeared into the darkened living room, from which now he could hear an ill-suppressed giggle of children and the scrape of a match. "All right," she called. "Now." They were at the table, and he looked into all three of their faces before he saw what it was that bathed them in a flickering yellow light. It was a cake with candles. Then came their slow, shrill singing, "Happy birthday to you." Jennifer's voice was the loudest, and April's was the only one in tune when they took the highest note, "Happy birthday, dear Daddy." But Michael was doing the best he could, and his was the widest smile. "Forgive you for what, April?" They were standing alone on the living room carpet, and she took a tentative step toward him. "Oh, for everything," she said, "for everything. The way I was all weekend, the way I've been ever since I got mixed up in that awful play. Oh, I've got so much to tell you, and I've got the most wonderful plan, Frank. Listen." But it wasn't easy to listen to anything over the outraged silence in his head. He felt like a monster. He had wolfed his dinner like a starving man and topped it off with 7 cloying forkfuls of chocolate cake. He had repeatedly exclaimed over the unwrapping of his birthday gifts, the very word he'd used to describe what Maureen Grube had been to him. Swell. Swell. He had heard his children's bedtime prayers and tiptoed from their room. Now he was allowing his wife to ask forgiveness, and at the same time, with a cold eye, he was discovering that she wasn't really very much to look at. She was too old and too tall and too intense. He wanted to rush outdoors and make some dramatic atonement, smash his fist against a tree or run for miles, leaping stone walls until he fell exhausted in a morass of mud and brambles. Instead, he shut his eyes and reached out and drew her close against him, crushing her cocktail apron in a desperate embrace, letting all his torment dissolve in pressing and stroking the inward curve of her back, while he urged his groaning, muttering mouth into her throat. "Oh, my lovely," he said. "Oh, my lovely girl. No, wait, listen. Do you know what I did all day? I missed you. And Frank, I've thought of the most wonderful. No, wait. I mean, I love you and everything, but listen a minute. The only way to stop her talking and get her out of sight was to kiss her mouth." And the floor began to tilt at dangerous angles, and they might have fallen into the office table if they hadn't taken 3 tottering steps and gone over instead into the voluptuous safety of the sofa. "Darling," she whispered, fighting for breath, "I do love you terribly, but don't you think we ought to... Oh, no, don't stop. Ought to what? Ought to sort of try and get into the bedroom first. But not if it makes you cross. We'll stay here if you like. I love you." "No, you're right, we will." He forced himself up, dragging her with him. "I better take a shower first, too." "Oh, no, don't. Please don't take a shower. I won't let you." "I've got to, April." "Why?" "Just because I've got to." It took all his will to move one heavy swing step at a time. "I think you're terribly mean," she was saying, clinging to his arm. "Terribly, terribly mean, Frank. Or terribly, terribly mean. Frank, did you like the presents? Was the tie all right? I went to about 14 different places and none of them had any decent ties. It's a swell tie. It's the nicest tie I've ever had." Under the stiff pelting of hot water in which Maureen Grube had become an adhesive second skin that only the most desperate scrubbing would shed, he decided he would have to tell her. He would soberly take hold of both her hands and say, "Listen, April, this afternoon He turned off all the hot water and turned up the cold, a thing he hadn't done in years. The shock of it sent him dancing and gasping, but he made himself stay under it until he counted to 30, the way he used to do in the army, and he came out feeling like $1,000,000. Tell her? Why, of course he wasn't going to tell her. What the hell would be the point of that? "Well, you look so clean," she said, whirling from the closet in her best white nightgown. "You look so clean and peaceful. Come sit beside me and let's talk a minute first, all right? Look what I've got." She had set a bottle of brandy and 2 glasses on the night table, but it was a long time before he allowed her to pour it or to say anything else. When she did pull away from him once, it was only to remove the constriction of lace from her shoulders and let it fall away from her breasts, whose nipples were hardening and rising even before he covered them with his hands. For the second time that day, he discovered that the act of love could leave him speechless, and he hoped she would be willing to let the talking wait for tomorrow. He knew that whatever she had to say would be said with that odd, the theatrical emphasis, and he didn't feel equipped to deal with it just now. All he wanted was to lie here smiling in the dark, confused and guilty and happy, and submit to the gathering weight of sleep. "Darling," her voice sounded very far away. "Darling, you're not going to sleep, are you? Because I do have so much to say and we're letting the brandy go to waste, and I haven't even had a chance to tell you about my plan." After a minute, he found it easy to stay awake, if only for the pleasure of sitting with her under the double cloak of a blanket, sipping brandy in the moonlight and hearing the rise and fall of her voice. Play acting or not, her voice in moods of love had always been a pretty sound. At last, with some reluctance, he began to pay attention to what she was saying. Her plan, the idea born of her sorrow and her missing him all day and her loving him, was an elaborate new program for going to Europe for good in the fall. Did he realize how much money they had? With their savings, with the proceeds from the sale of the house and the car, and with what they could save between now and September, they'd have enough to live comfortably for 6 months. And it won't take anything like 6 months before we're established and self supporting again for as long as we like. That's the best part. He cleared his throat. Look, baby, in the first place, what kind of a job could I possibly? No kind of a job. Oh, I know you could get any job anywhere in the world if you had to, but that's not the point. The point is, you won't be getting any kind of a job because I will. Don't laugh. Listen a minute. Have you any idea how much they pay for secretarial work in all these government agencies overseas? NATO and the ECA and those places? And do you realize how low the cost of living is compared to here? She had it all figured out. She had read an article in a magazine. Her skills at typing and shorthand would bring them enough to live on and more. Enough for a part-time servant to take care of the children while she worked. It was, she insisted, such a marvelously simple plan that she was amazed at having never thought of it before. But she had to keep interrupting herself with mounting impatience to tell him not to laugh. This laughter of his was not quite genuine, nor was the way he kept squeezing her shoulder as if to dismiss the whole thing as an endearing whimsy. He was trying to conceal from her, if not from himself, that the plan had instantly frightened him. I'm serious about this, Frank, she said. Do you think I'm kidding or something? No, I know. I just have a couple of questions is all. For one thing, what exactly am I supposed to be doing while you're out earning all this dough? She drew back and tried to examine his face in the dim light, as if she couldn't believe he had failed to understand. Don't you see? Don't you see that's the whole idea? You'll be doing what you should have been allowed to do 7 years ago. You'll be finding yourself. You'll be reading and studying and taking long walks and thinking. You'll have time. For the first time in your life, you'll have the time to find out what it is you want to do. And when you find it, you'll have the time and the freedom to start doing it. And that, he knew as he chuckled and shook his head, was what he'd been afraid she would say. He had a quick, disquieting vision of her coming home from a day at the office, wearing a Parisian tailored suit, briskly pulling off her gloves, coming home and finding him hunched in an egg-stained bathrobe, on an unmade bed, picking his nose. Look, he began. He let his hand slide off her shoulder and work its way up under her arm to fondle the shape and the light weight of her breast. In the first place, all this is very sweet and very... It's not sweet. She pronounced the word as if it were the quintessence of everything she despised, and she caught at his hand and threw it down as if it were despicable too. For God's sake, Frank, I'm not being sweet. I'm not making any big altruistic sacrifice. Can't you see that? Okay, it's not sweet. Don't get sore. Whatever it is, though, I think you'll have to agree it isn't very realistic. That's all I meant. In order to agree with that, she said, I'd have to have a very strange and very low opinion of reality. Because you see, I happen to think this is unrealistic. I think it's unrealistic for a man with a fine mind to go on working like a dog year after year at a job he can't stand, coming home to a house he can't stand and a place he can't stand either, to a wife who's equally unable to stand the same things, living among a bunch of frightened little... My God, Frank, I don't have to tell you what's wrong with this environment. I'm practically quoting you. Just last night when the Campbells were here, remember what you said about the whole idea of suburbia being to keep reality at bay? You said everybody wanted to bring up their children in a bath of sentimentality. You said, I know what I said. I didn't think you were listening, though. You looked sort of bored. I was bored. That's part of what I'm trying to say. I don't think I've ever been more bored and depressed and fed up in my life than I was last night. All that business about Helen Givings' son on top of everything else, and the way we all grabbed at it like dogs after meat. I remember looking at you and thinking, God, if only he'd stopped talking. Because everything you said was based on this great premise of ours that we're somehow very special and superior to the whole thing. And I wanted to say, but we're not. Look at us. We're just like the people you're talking about. We are the people you're talking about. I sort of had, I don't know, contempt for you because you couldn't see the terrific fallacy of the thing. And then this morning when you left, when you were backing the car around at the turn, I saw you look back at the house as if it was going to bite you. You looked so miserable, I started to cry. And then I started feeling lonely as hell, and I thought, well, how did everything get so awful then? If it's not his fault, whose fault is it? How did we ever get into this strange little dream world of the Donaldsons and the Kramers and the Wingates? Oh, yes, and the Campbells, too. Because another thing I figured out today is that both those Campbells are a big, 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 colossal waste of time. And it suddenly began to dawn on me. Honestly, Frank, it was like a revelation or something. I was standing there in the kitchen, and it suddenly began to dawn on me that it's my fault. It's always been my fault. And I can tell you when it began. I can tell you the exact moment in time when it began. Don't interrupt me. But he knew better than to interrupt her now. She must have spent the morning in an agony of thought, pacing up and down the rooms of a dead silent, dead clean house, and twisting her fingers at her waist until they ached. She must have spent the afternoon in a frenzy of action at the shopping center, lurching her car imperiously through mazes of no left turn signs and angry traffic cops, racing in and out of stores to buy the birthday gifts and the roast beef and the cake and the cocktail apron. Her whole day had been a heroic build-up for this moment of self-abasement. Now it was here, and she was damned if she'd stand for any interference. It was way back on Bethune Street, she said. It was when I first got pregnant with Jennifer and told you I was going to, abort her. I mean, up until that moment, you didn't want a baby any more than I did. Why should you have? But when I went out and bought that rubber syringe, I put the whole burden of the thing on you. It was like saying, all right then, if you want this baby, it's going to be all your responsibility. You're going to have to turn yourself inside out to provide for us. You'll have to give up any idea of being anything in the world but a father. Frank, if only you'd given me what I deserved. If only you'd call me a bitch and turned your back on me, you could have called my bluff in a minute. I'd probably never have gone through with the whole thing. I probably never have gone through with the thing. I probably wouldn't have had the courage for one thing, but you didn't. You were too good and young and scared. You played right along with it. And that's how the whole thing started. That's how we both got committed to this enormous delusion. Because that's what it is, an enormous, obscene delusion. This idea that people have to resign from real life and settle down when they have families. It's the great sentimental lie of the suburbs, and I've been making you subscribe to it all this time. I've been making you live by it. My God, I've even gone as far as to work up this completely corny soap opera picture of myself. And I guess this is what really brought it home to me. This picture of myself as the girl who could have been the actress if she hadn't gotten married too young. And I mean, you know perfectly well I was never any kind of an actress and never really wanted to be. You know, I only went to the academy to get away from home, and I know it too. I've always known it. And here for 3 months, I've been walking around with this noble, bittersweet expression on my face. I mean, how self-deluded can you get? Do you see how neurotic all this is? I wanted to have it both ways. It wasn't enough that I'd spoiled your life. I wanted to I wanted to bring the whole monstrous thing full circle and make it seem that you'd spoiled mine, so I could end up being the victim. Isn't that awful? But it's true. It's true. And at each true, she thumped a tight little fist on her naked knee. Now do you see what you have to forgive me for? And why we have to get out of here and over to Europe as fast as we possibly can? It isn't a case of my being sweet or generous or anything else. I'm not doing you any favors. All I'm giving you is what you've always been entitled to, and I'm only sorry it has come so late. All right, can I talk now? Yes, you do understand though, don't you? And could I have a little more of the brandy? Just a splash? That's fine. Thanks. When she'd sipped at it, she threw back her hair, allowing the blanket to slide from her shoulders, and drew a little away from him in order to sit back against the wall, tucking her legs up beneath her. She looked wholly relaxed and confident, ready to listen, happy in the knowledge that she'd stated her case. The blue-white luminescence of her body was a powerful force. He knew he wouldn't be able to think straight if he looked at her, so he willed himself to look at the moonlit floor beneath his feet, and he took longer than necessary over the lighting of a cigarette, stalling for time. He would have to get his bearings. When she came home to the Paris apartment, her spike-heeled pumps would click decisively on the tile floor, and her hair would be pulled back into a neat bun. Her face would be drawn with fatigue so that the little vertical line between her eyes would show, even when she smiled. On the other hand, in the first place, he said at last, I think you're being much too hard on yourself. Nothing's ever that black and white. You didn't force me to take the job at Knox. Besides, look at it this way. You say you've always known you weren't really an actress, and therefore it's not too legitimate for you to go around feeling cheated. Well, let's face it. Isn't it just possible the same thing applies to me? I mean, whoever said I was supposed to be a big deal? I don't know what you mean, she said calmly. I think it might be rather tiresome if you were a big deal. But if you mean whoever said you were exceptional, if you mean whoever said you had a first-rate original mind, well, my God, Frank, the answer is everybody. When I first met you, you were, oh hell, I was a little wise guy with a big mouth. I was showing off a lot of erudition I didn't have. You were not. How can you talk that way? Frank, has it gotten so bad that you've lost all your belief in yourself? Well, no. He had to admit it hadn't quite gotten that bad. Besides, he was afraid he could detect a note of honest doubt in her voice, a faint suggestion that it might be possible to persuade her he had been a little wise guy after all. And this was distressing. Okay, he conceded. Okay, let's say I was a promising kid. The point is, there were plenty of promising kids at Columbia. That doesn't necessarily mean there weren't plenty like you, she said, sounding reassured. I'll never forget what's his name, the one you always admired so much, the one who'd been the fighter pilot and had all the girls, Bill Croft. I'll never forget the way he used to talk about you. He said to me once, if I had half that guy's brains, I'd quit worrying. And he meant it. Everybody knew there was nothing in the world you couldn't do or be if only you had the chance to find yourself. Anyway, all that's besides the point. You wouldn't have to be the least bit exceptional, and this would still be a thing that has to be done. Don't you see that? Will you let me finish? In the first place. But instead of allowing his voice to run on, he felt the need to be quiet for a minute. He took a deep drink of brandy, letting it burn the roof of his mouth and send out waves of warmth across his shoulders and down his spine as he solemnly stared at the floor. Had Bill Croft really said that? Everything you say might make a certain amount of sense, he began again. And one of the ways he could tell he was losing the argument was that his voice had taken on a resonance that made it every bit as theatrical as hers. It was the voice of a hero, a voice befitting the kind of person Bill Croft could admire. Might make a certain amount of sense if I had some definite, measurable talent. If I were an artist, say, or a writer. Frank, can you really think that Can you really think artists and writers are the only people entitled to lives of their own? Listen, I don't care if it takes you 5 years of doing nothing at all. I don't care if you decide after 5 years that what you really want is to be a bricklayer, or a mechanic, or a merchant seaman. Don't you see what I'm saying? It's got nothing to do with definite measurable talents. It's your very essence that's being stifled here. It's what you are that's being denied and denied and denied in this kind of life. And what's that? For the first time, he allowed himself to look at her. Not only to look, but to put down his glass and take hold of her leg, and she covered and pressed his hand with both of her own. Well, don't you know? She brought his hand gently up her hip and around to the flat of her abdomen, where she pressed it close again. Don't you know? You're the most valuable and wonderful thing in the world. You're a man. And of all the capitulations in his life, this was the one that seemed most like a victory. Never before had elation welled more powerfully inside him. Never had beauty grown more purely out of truth. Never in taking his wife had he triumphed more completely over time and space. The past could dissolve at his will, and so could the future. So could the walls of this house and the whole imprisoning wasteland beyond it, towns and trees. He had taken command of the universe because he was a man, and because the marvelous creature who opened and moved for him, tender and strong, was a woman. At the first bright, hesitant calls of awakening birds, when the massed trees were turning from gray to olive green in a rising mist, she gently touched his lips with her fingertips. Darling, we really are going to do it, aren't we? I mean, it hasn't just been a lot of talk or anything, has it? He was on his back, taking pleasure in the slow rise and fall of his own chest, which felt broad and deep and muscled enough to fill the modeling of a medieval breastplate. Was there anything he couldn't do? Was there any voyage he couldn't undertake and any prize in life he couldn't promise her? No, he said. Because I'd like to get started on it right away. Tomorrow, writing letters and whatnot and seeing about the passports. And I think we ought to tell Niffer and Mike about it right away too, don't you? They'll need a little time to get used to it, and besides, I want them to know before anybody else, don't you? Yes. But I don't want to tell them unless you're absolutely sure. I'm absolutely sure. That's wonderful. Darling, look at the time. It's practically light outside. You'll be dead tired. No, I won't. I can sleep on the train. I can sleep at the office. It's all right. All right. I love you. And they fell asleep like children.